Thank you. Really nice to see all of you, some of your faces and some of your names. See some names of folks I haven't seen in a long time. So special welcome to you and those who I haven't met before. I haven't taught at Sangha Live for some time, so it's really uh, nice to be here again. And as was said, the topic for today will be exploring the theme of refuge. And my hope is that we'll do that in a variety of ways, starting in a moment with meditation. So we'll begin our exploration of taking refuge, of discovering refuge in our meditative practice. And then I'll speak about it for a while and then really warmly, fully invite your questions, your reflections, anything you would like to say or add to what I've said that would help flesh out and deepen the conversation. So let's begin by practicing together. And I used to always say, I'm trying to get myself off the big screen so I can see all of you. There we go. I used to always say, let's sit together, but really you are welcome to take any posture that works for you, whether that's sitting or standing or lying down. You want to find a way to settle the body so that you feel a sense of both stability, a kind of groundedness, a sense of ease, and also a kind of aliveness. So for me, when I begin, I like to either let my eyes close or invite you to let your eyes close, or if you prefer, just have a soft gaze down, letting your attention, your awareness come inward. And maybe taking a few deep, full breaths. Just letting the chest and belly rise on the inhale and letting it all go on the exhale. And then letting your breath return to its own natural rhythm. I like to begin by feeling the weight of the body, feeling the heaviness, the density of the bones and muscles, and really allowing all of that to sink down, rest down. Feeling the earth element of the body resting on the earth. And as best you can, allowing yourself to feel supported, held. And as the weight of the body, the density of the bones and muscles really sinks down, rests down. Also feeling the length of the body, that long vertical core of the spine that rises up, a kind of inner architecture. It gives the body a sense of verticality, of dignity, of uplift. And feeling the length of the spine without tightening or gripping. We're not looking for a rigid spine, but really allowing the natural curves of the spine. The softening of the belly. And checking that the ears are lined up with the shoulders. so that the weight of the skull is balanced at the top of the spine and there's no strain or pulling in the shoulders or the upper back. Maybe very gently feeling the crown of the head, the very top of the head, pushing up very slightly toward the ceiling and the sky. So simultaneously sinking down, resting down, and rising up. And then scanning very gently through the body from the top of the head down, just inviting any places of gripping or holding left over from the day or the week or the year, inviting those places to soften and relax. Softening the eyes, the jaw, the tongue. Letting the shoulders relax and melt away from the ears. Feeling how the shoulder blades can glide down the back in a way that allows the sternum, the front of the chest to lift and to open. Softening the hands, the ribs, the diaphragm, the low back, and the belly. Continuing to scan down through the hips, the legs, all the way down into the ankles, the feet, the toes. Letting your awareness, your attention open and expand to fill the whole body. Seeing how is it to feel or sense the body from the inside. And maybe noticing what's the energetic quality of the body as you tune in, listen in. You may feel a sense of heaviness, of tiredness. You may feel tingling or buzzing or pulsing, kind of aliveness of the body. You may be aware of a sense of stillness. whatever's here, whatever's true for you now. The practice is, how can we be with each moment of experience just as it is? Opening, receiving, allowing, and keeping it very simple. Resting in the awareness of the body. And if it's helpful, you could become aware of the particular sensations of the body breathing. No need to change or force the breath in any way. Just seeing how all on its own, without any special effort from you, the body breathes. And if there's difficulty, distress, discomfort somewhere in the body as you tune in or listen in, finding a place that feels safe with a sense of ease, perhaps placing your attention in your hands or your feet. Letting the body be a place of refuge, a place of homecoming, of return. Knowing that it's normal for the mind to become aware of waves of feeling, or that perpetual process of thinking, and see what it's like if you don't grab on and get swept away in the content, but with no need to tighten or reject or push anything away. Resting in the immediacy of the felt sense of the body, and the body breathing here, now, again and again. where the mind can be pulled into the future, and thoughts, planning, worrying, wondering, or pulled into the past, remembering, rehashing. The body is always here, in this moment, in the present. Know that in any moment you can always return, come home, welcoming yourself right where you are, just as you are, moment by moment. And as you continue to rest in the simple awareness of the body breathing, inviting you to bring your awareness, your attention to the heart center, that area at the center of the chest. And if it's helpful, you could place a hand or hands gently across the chest. I like to imagine I could literally breathe in and out of the heart, beginning just by noticing what's here, what's true for you now. As you tune in, listen in, is there a feeling or a feeling tone, a mood, a predominant emotion? If you were going to describe to someone how you were feeling, what might you say? What is the quality, the felt sense of your experience as you listen in to your own heart? Whatever's here, whatever's true, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, clear or fuzzy, can you be with it, whatever it is, just as it is? And on the next inhalation, imagining you could breathe in through the heart a sense of warmth, of kindness, of care and compassion for yourself. I like often to imagine that I was breathing in the warmth of the sun, the warmth of the sun's rays, letting all of that warmth and kindness come in through the heart and fill the whole body. Breathing in through the heart, quality of friendliness, of tenderness, of loving kindness for yourself. And if there are places in the mind, the heart, the body where there's some particular ache or difficulty, really directing these waves of kindness, of care and compassion to those places in yourself. As you continue to breathe in through the heart, on the next exhalation, extending out, sending out these same warm rays of kindness and care, of friendliness and warmth to all of the others who've dialed in for this Sangha Live session today. Sending out your care and compassion with each exhalation. And breathing in and out through the heart in this way, receiving and extending kindness, warmth, care, and compassion for yourself and for each other. And finally, imagining that all of our collective care and well-wishing could extend out, move out in all directions. I always imagine this giant, gentle wave of kindness and care extending east and west, north and south, above and below, touching the lives of your friends, families, loved ones, extending wider and wider to include the many, many beings, known and unknown, seen and unseen, especially those who are struggling, experiencing all kinds of difficulties that we are facing in our world. Violence and war, a climate crisis as it plays out across the planet, of oppression, discrimination, and harm. Offering our care and well-wishing to ease the suffering of all beings in all directions. So I'm going to continue to talk this morning for me, this evening for many of you, about where it is and how it is that we find a sense of refuge in the midst of difficult times. It feels now more than ever that old systems and structures are beginning to crack and come undone. And in the midst of that, all kinds of trouble. That's so often when things feel unsteady or unstable that there's a tendency to reach for control, for power, for some kind of security. And yet what we see around us is both a widening of the divide, an increasing inability for people to even be able to talk to each other across differences, across diversity of opinions, and an increasing reaching for a kind of authoritarian power, control, leadership, an increasing degree of othering. And what do we do in the midst of this? How do we find a sense of refuge? We're seeing it here in the US, for those of you in Europe, certainly in the context of the Middle East. It's hard from where I'm sitting to look anywhere and see and not see this kind of trouble. And what I want to propose today is that the Buddhist teachings in general and the teachings of refuge in particular are made for this. They're made for this kind of trouble. And one of the things that has been helpful for me in understanding this has been looking at and studying some the historical context of the time and place of the Buddha. And many of you know probably that the Buddhist teachings are handed down in an oral tradition for about 400 years. Nothing was written down. And so often when you look at the teachings, you find these kind of lists of teaching. You find a lot of repetition of things. And all of that was part of the effort to be able to remember and repeat what the Buddha said. So we have all of this kind of teaching, but we've lost a lot of the context of the teaching. And for me, it's been very helpful to understand that the Buddha also lived in the midst of very difficult times. This was in, northern India, Nepal, 2,600 years ago. And of course, there are many, many differences. That time and place is a different culture than our culture. Certainly the Buddha didn't have to worry about social media, or climate crisis. But it was also a time that was quite fraught, that a lot of the social systems and structures were crumbling, falling down. And many of you probably know that the Buddha lived at a time when there was a very strict, kind of rigid caste system. And at the top of the caste were the Brahmins, the spiritual leaders, guides. And the Brahmin authority was being challenged in large part by the rise of the merchant class. And it was really in that vacuum, as the Brahmin hold on kind of the power of the culture began to crack, that all of these new kind of upstart spiritual teachings, including what we know now as Buddhism, arose. So Buddhism was one of many, upstart's a good word for it, new spiritual practices that arose in that vacuum. And there was also a lot of kind of political and structural change. What had been a series of small kind of tribal fiefdoms, they were now being reconfigured as larger, both monarchies and, in some cases, the early examples of democratic systems. But what that meant was that there was a lot of war. There was a lot of violence happening where tribes were fighting with one another. And many people aren't aware, I wasn't aware myself, that the Buddha's own family, the Shakya or Sakya clan, was basically decimated by the neighboring tribe. And despite his best efforts to stop that war from happening, to stop that violence from happening, the Buddha wasn't successful. So in the midst of all of that, both kind of widespread and also for him very personal upheaval and violence, he brought forward these beautiful liberative teachings. So his teachings didn't come out of a place of ease. They didn't come out of a place of everything was going smoothly. They came out of a place of tremendous difficulty for him as well. And many of you have probably heard the phrase, summary of the Buddhist teachings that goes something like, I teach one thing and one thing only, suffering and the end of suffering. And I think important to recognize, and this translates to our understanding of refuge, that the end of suffering doesn't mean, 24/7, all good times, right? That the end of suffering doesn't mean bad things don't happen. As I said, even the Buddha's own family was killed. So that's not what suffering means. Suffering, the end of suffering is, so one of my old Zen teachers used to say, it's not making things worse. And many of you may be familiar with this called the Salata Sutta, the arrow or the dart, in which the Buddha is giving a talk to his monks, and he says, if someone is struck in the arm with an arrow, is that painful? And the monks are pretty sharp, so they go, yep, that's painful. And he says, well, then if someone sticks themselves with a second arrow, is that helpful? Nope, that's not helpful. And he basically says, that's what it's like. The first arrow is inevitable. It's inevitable that there will be difficulty in our lives as human beings. But what we can do is avoid adding arrows. That's what the end of suffering means. It means not piling on. It's already hard enough. I think many of us carry a sense of what I think of as a kind of false refuge. When we don't look closely, we may imagine. I have an old teacher who used to call this the island where it all works out. That we may imagine that that's what refuge looks like. That refuge is that somehow we get to this island where everything's okay. But that is a kind of false refuge. And it's actually a bit of a distraction for us because it takes us away from where true refuge is found. And really what I want to propose is that refuge, the whole teaching of refuge, is in itself a kind of radical reorientation, where instead of engaging in the usual ways that we look for safety, for security, for refuge, that the teaching itself is helping us learn to look in a different place. And that in fact, refuge isn't a place. It isn't an island. It isn't a somewhere. That refuge is more of an attitude. It is more of a being with. It's how we meet what's here. And I think to understand this more clearly, it may be helpful to give a little bit of what I think of as kind of Buddhist psychology 101. And this is Buddhist psychology is not so similar to Western psychology. It's not about so much our karmic inheritance and our personal and cultural familial histories. Buddhist psychology is much more of a kind of phenomenological explanation of how moments of experience arise. And the basic idea goes something like this. Moment by moment, we are flooded with sensory experience. Sensory experience means what we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we taste, what we touch, what we think, what comes in through the sense doors. And interestingly, the mind is considered a sense door in Buddhist psychology. So moment by moment, that's what experience looks like, sounds like, smells like, tastes like, thinks like, And every moment of experience that comes in through the sense doors is said to have one of three flavors. This is called the Vedana, Vedana. And the Vedana is either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, neither pleasant or unpleasant. And most neutral Vedana, we basically miss. It doesn't register unless we're pretty quiet. And then we may start to become aware of neutral. But most of us, what the Buddha would call neutral, we think of as boring, or just the moments that we don't register at all. Most of the time, what we're registering is pleasant and unpleasant. We see something, we like it, we want it, we grasp it, we try to hold on to it. And then the same on the flip side. Something is unpleasant, we don't like it, we don't want it, we try to push it away, reject it, ignore it, deny it, or judge it and criticize it, right? So this is the fundamental reactivity of human life, that moment by moment, we're getting batted back and forth between pleasant and unpleasant, liking and not liking, wanting and not wanting, grasping and aversion, we would call it. And the core fantasy is if only I could get more of what I want, if only I could get away from what I don't want, then I could be on that island, the place where it all works out. And this misunderstanding that many of us are kind of habitually, reactively moving through our lives without being conscious of it even, this prevents us in a way from finding true refuge. But as we begin to see the futility, and it doesn't mean that if you have a pleasant experience that you shouldn't enjoy it, please. When things are enjoyable, please enjoy them. Just don't hang on, right? And you'll notice if you pay attention that there's a difference between a moment of enjoyment, which is pleasant, is enjoyable, and then trying to make it stay, which is instantly not pleasant, not enjoyable, right? So the path, the practice is about stepping out of that fundamental reactivity that keeps the wheel of samsara turning. And as we step out of that, we step into the possibility of finding true refuge. So refuge, as I said, isn't a place. It is an attitude. It's a reorientation to how we engage with our lives. And it's part of why, for me, the teaching of refuge is so core to all of the Buddhist teachings. The doorway of refuge is a very full entry into the heart of Buddhist teaching because it asks us to reorient in this way. And the path of practice is a path of reorientation. The Buddha talked about going against the stream. And he very much went against the stream of the cultural norms of his time. But he also was going against the stream of this kind of habitual reactivity and inviting us into a way of living that was more intentional, less reactive, that offers the possibility of freedom. So the word refuge in the Latin is refuge, and that re means again, and refuge is to fly back. And that begins to give you that sense of reorientation, that our tendency is to want to go out. In America, we have this country western song that says something like, looking for love in all the wrong places, right? That's our tendency, is to go out, and refuge is to come back in. In Zen, we say you turn the light around, take the backward step and turn the light inwardly. That refuge is actually a quality of heart and mind where we can rest, where we step off the wheel of perpetual self-improvement and judgment and effort and trying to get somewhere. And we allow ourselves, as we are practicing, when we practice meditation, we're practicing being here, because that's where we find refuge. I think it's important to say, as particularly in this world at this time, that what I'm pointing to isn't a kind of passivity, but that this quality of refuge, of having a place of rest, of having a homecoming, of this reorienting, is necessary so that we can act. So that we can act rather than react. So that when we engage with the real trouble, the real difficulty of the world, we aren't just adding fuel to the fire. We aren't making things worse. We're actually able to come from a place that is creative, that is inspired, that is in alignment with what we care about most. So there's a story in about the place called the City of Refuge. And I know I just said that refuge isn't an actual place, but there is a place on the big island of Hawaii called the City of Refuge. And the story about the City of Refuge gives a sense of what this quality of refuge really is. And the story is that the indigenous people who lived on the island of Hawaii had rules, what we would think of as kind of ethics or precepts for how to live together peacefully. And when someone broke one of those rules, if they could get to the City of Refuge, which is an actual little spit of land, they would be forgiven. And this was not a small thing, because you had to travel under the hot sun over, on foot, usually being chased by people who were pursuing you for whatever you had done wrong to get to this place. But if you could get there, you would be forgiven. You could begin again. And this is the spirit of refuge, the heart of refuge. It's this recognition that it's okay for us to make mistakes, that for each of us to find that place in ourselves where we can begin again, where we can forgive ourselves for whatever it is that we've done. And if we've done harm externally, we can ask for forgiveness and begin again. This is the spirit of refuge. So in traditional Buddhist teaching, we take refuge in what's called the three treasures, the three jewels, the triple gem, it's sometimes called, which are Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And I always tell this story because it's so good, that the first time I heard about the triple treasure was in a Dharma talk, and I was sitting in a zendo, and someone was describing what the triple treasure were. The teacher was describing it, and the woman who was sitting next to me leaned over and whispered to me, "I thought the triple treasure was breakfast, lunch, and dinner." So that's part of the reorientation, right? The triple treasure isn't just getting pleasant experience. That's actually what we think. We think that if I can just get enough pleasant experience, that will be a place of refuge. But the real triple treasure are the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And I'll just say a few words about each one, and then we can open for some discussion. So the Buddha, actually, each of the three treasures can be understood at a number of different levels. So first, there is the historical level. So the Buddha, as I described earlier, was a historical person who lived 2,600 years ago. And this is important from a place of understanding taking refuge, because the Buddha was a human being. He wasn't a god, he wasn't a deva. He was a person like us, who struggled like us, who had personal struggles, there were cultural struggles, there were familial struggles, all of that. And so what we're taking refuge in isn't something other, right? Isn't something exceptional. It is this human potential that we share. There's also an archetypal kind of, I think, of the historical, and then the archetypal is like the broad understanding of each of these jewels. And the broad understanding of the Buddha is as the representation of, mostly we think of the Buddha as like a spiritual sage. I also think of the Buddha, if again you look at the history, as a social revolutionary. The Buddha offered these beautiful teachings. That's what the Buddha said. But what the Buddha did was something quite radical, which is that he established a Sangha, a community that invited everybody in the midst of this very rigid caste system in which you were limited to your level that you were born into. The Buddha said, nope, everybody's equal, everybody can join. It may be hard to understand what a radical thing that was, but he did that. So this is the archetype of the Buddha as both spiritual sage and social revolutionary. And many of the real revolutionary voices of our time have been people who were deeply rooted in spiritual practice. You know, Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, Dr. King. They often go together in this way. And this is a beautiful archetype for us to take up. And finally, we take refuge in what I think of as the essence of the Buddha treasure, which is our own Buddha nature. That because the Buddha was a human being, that human potential lives here, not just in me, but in each of us. This is very difficult for us, I think, many people who come out of the Western religious context, because regardless of kind of what your specific religious upbringing was, there is this thread of original sin, this kind of primary assumption that there's something wrong that needs to be fixed. And I'm saying this because it's not true in Buddhist understanding. But in Buddhist understanding, what's here, or the essence of us, is fundamentally good. And the reason we practice a wisdom tradition is not because we're bad, but because we're mixed up. We're confused. That's why it's a wisdom tradition. So what we're looking to find is with our clarity, with our capacity to see clearly and be with, we begin to have our false ideas, our confused ideas fall away. And as we see more and more clearly, we begin to recognize the fundamental goodness that's here, but is also in every person. And as that happens, where we take refuge, how we take refuge can also begin to shift. We take refuge in Dharma. That's the second treasure, which from a historical perspective are the recorded teachings of the Buddha that were written down in the suttas, remembered by Ananda. Those of you who have read the suttas will see that each one begins with the words, "Thus have I heard." That's the voice of Ananda, who is speaking orally the teachings of the Buddha that were then, as I said, passed on in this oral tradition and recorded. There are a lot of things that were probably written out in the 400 years of oral tradition. By the time the Buddhist teachings were written down, we know for sure that largely the voices and stories of women were largely written out of those teachings. So it's not to say that the teachings aren't true, what we've received, the written teachings, but to, again, understand them within a cultural context and to recognize that they are likely incomplete, right? They aren't both incomplete and perhaps biased. You might say both things. Ultimately, taking refuge in the Dharma treasure is to take refuge in the truth. Dharma, in its simplest definition, means truth. And this is a really radical premise, right? Because taking refuge in the truth means to take refuge in what's here right now. And again, sometimes we like what's here, sometimes we don't like what's here, sometimes we're bored by what's here. But that's the teaching, and that's the orientation. Instead of, I'll take refuge in something over there, no, we take refuge in now. We take refuge in now. We take refuge in now. This is the radical reorientation for most of us. And for me, the description of this, a beautiful description of this comes from Dogen Zenji, who's the founder of Soto Zen, in a text called the Genjo Koan, which can be translated as the koan of what's happening right now. And in that, he says, when you sail out in a boat to the middle of the ocean, where no land is in sight, and you view the four directions, the ocean looks circular, and it does not look any other way. But the ocean is neither round nor square. Its features are infinite in variety. It only looks circular as far as your eye of practice can see at this time. It is like a palace. It is like a jewel. All things are like this. So the premise here, what we take refuge in, is that if we're willing to pay attention to the koan of what's unfolding right now, that what we see will open. That what looks like just a simple circle, what looks like gazing across the top of the water, when we look down under the water, whole worlds open to us. This is the premise of the Dharma, that we don't have to get across the water to the other side, that we can actually drop down and be right here. And when that happens, there's revelation. And the last thing I'll say, because I want to make sure that we have some time for your um, comments, questions, is the Sangha jewel. The Sangha jewel is us. The original Sangha jewel, the Buddha described as the fourfold Sangha: monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen. I would say from our standpoint, that's shorthand for everybody. Everybody's included, right? And there's a famous story where Ananda says to the Buddha, I understand. The Sangha jewel is fully half of the holy life. So Ananda often plays a foil in the stories with the Buddha. And he's having this big insight, recognizing the importance of the Sangha. And the Buddha, as he often does, reprimands him and says, don't say that, Ananda, don't say that. The Sangha is fully the whole of the holy life. So maybe I don't need to say that here at Sangha Live because there is an understanding, a recognition of the importance of Sangha, of the importance that we practice together. And this is really the Sangha jewel. You know, the historical version is the fourfold Sangha, but in its essence and in its archetype, Sangha jewel is the truth of our deep connectedness. The truth that we always practice together. The truth that when we find refuge, we don't do it alone. That we do it by joining hands with all beings everywhere, because that's how it actually is. So I have many more things I could say, but I'm going to pause and invite your, if you have questions, you're welcome to ask. And also if you have anything you'd like to add or say to enhance, you know, in the spirit of the Sangha jewel, I really feel like we together have a more thorough understanding of the teaching than just me. So please, Violet. There you go.
Hi, thanks, Pam.
Hi. Yeah.
So I I grew up Jewish, but never believing in God, but having this kind of existential loneliness, like, oh man, that'd be nice to believe in God.
Mm,
And then when I started meditating about 10 years ago, I found like the teachings and the refuges, like it kind of scratched that itch. It kind of, for me,
mm,
will like solve the sort of existential loneliness.
mm,
And yet I'll go through periods of being just like really into practice and getting a lot of like comfort and stability from the teachings. And yet then I'll go through periods of just like not sitting, not connecting to the Dharma. Um, I don't know. Last year, it's like I had a 6 month daily meditation streak and then I lost it. And then I'm just like off the cushion for a few months. And I'm
yeah.
wondering like will that end at some point? Like at some point will I just be like so committed or faithful that I'll just be like on it for the rest of my life? Or and like is the solution like sometimes I'm like, is the solution the refuges? Because that's like what I find like the most inspiring in the practice. Or
Mm,
I don't know, if you have magical words to get me to meditate every day for the rest of my life, I'll take them.
mm. Yeah, I mean, I'm smiling at your question, but it's very poignant because I know for sure that you're not alone in that struggle. And I'll tell you my sort of personal theory and take on this, which is that Western convert Buddhism, the teachings that came out of Asia and have been translated to the West, have done a pretty good job of creating retreat centers and places where we can go do intensive practice and, you know, really plug in. But we haven't done such a good job yet of what you're pointing to, which is really helping all of us find ways to bring the practice into our daily lives, right? And so for me, that's both a frustration that it hasn't happened, but it's also an opportunity, right? To recognize that there's something that you want, and probably you can't do it alone. This is part of the Sangha jewel, right? And we live in a very a culture or cultures, because I know there's people dialing in from all over, where the sort of fabric of community has broken down in many, many ways. And so here we are on Zoom, right, doing Dharma together. Um, so there's one part of it which is you tapping into what you care about most, which you've been speaking to, and letting that lead you. And then there's the other part, which is finding support, finding community, finding ways that you don't have to just have that 6 months be driven by willpower and then feel bad when you fall off. Because I think that's how it is for most people. And I also think that we haven't yet discovered kind of many ways to integrate the practice into our lives, right? We still think of practice as I'm sitting on my cushion and then my life is over here. So for me, this is one of the places that I'm most interested in finding ways to infuse that into my life. And I don't have answers exactly, but I do have a real wish to discover. And so I would encourage you to take this up not as a failing on your part, but as a place to explore and discover. What would it look like for you, and what would you need? What kind of support would you need to really, well, in your case, sit every day, but really to bring the practice fully into the heart of your life, which is what I hear you asking. Yeah? Yeah. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
I don't have,
That's very
I will
helpful.
say, yeah, and I intentionally don't have a, here are the 3 easy steps to, because I don't think it's that kind of thing. I think that it's a thing that is much more, it's more tender, it's more heartfelt, and it's nascent, I think, for those of us who are Western convert Buddhists. We don't quite know how to do it yet. We're finding our way. Yeah. So I appreciate you expressing what may be true for many people, and helping us all find our way in that way. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Ooh, how about, let's see, Victoria, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk today. I really enjoyed it. And it's always great to return to the refuges. I just had a few comments I want to make about a few of the things that you mentioned today. My field of, I guess, orientation is interfaith dialogue. And so I just wanted to say a few things about some of the things that you said. That the cities of refuge in Hawaii, nobody actually knows the date that they originated. They were first written about in the 19th century, early 19th century. Obviously, they're older than that. But I just wanted to point out, in terms of history, the longstanding tradition in the Jewish, in the Hebrew Bible, which is actually, well, the latest scholars think that the Hebrew Bible, the book of Exodus, where it first comes up, it runs all the way through the Hebrew Bible. The latest scholars, the most conservative estimate in terms of making it recent was the 6th century BC, which is interesting because it's the same time as Buddhism and as the Buddha. So it's kind of an interesting parallel, I thought. And then just about the people you mentioned, Nelson Mandela, Dr. King, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. I just wanted to point out, because there's a lot of what I'm mostly involved in Buddhist dialogue right now, but I've noticed that there's while these people like Mandela and Tutu and Dr. King are claimed in the this the fight for justice and anti-racism and compassion and love and all the things that we believe in as Buddhists. They were Christians. So because there's a lot, there are some secular Buddhist teachers in the West who vilify Christianity, and I don't think that helps with interfaith dialogue or compassion as a community. So I just wanted to point out, that the people you chose to mention today in your talk actually are Christians or were Christians. They're all passed away, unfortunately. But also the idea of original sin, because essentially I think that's been misunderstood by the secular world, that it's the Christian tradition is actually that humanity is inherently good. And so for me personally, well, I won't go into my personal thing because you have a lot of people wanting to ask questions, but I just wanted to say that for me, it's the traditions really enhance each other and complement each other beautifully. And I don't see any conflict at all between the practice of Buddhism and the practice of Christianity. On the contrary, I think they really enrich each other. So I just wanted to bring those things up as an encouragement to the Sangha, that it's not necessary to I shouldn't say put one tradition down, because you didn't do that. And I really respected your talk and enjoyed it. But just, I think the more open we can be and the more open our hearts can be, the more we who follow a spiritual path can become a global Sangha of interbeing, the way that Thich Nhat Hanh taught about, so that together we can do a lot more than in all these little splintered spiritual traditions, which I think none of us, want to have. So anyway, I just wanted to say that with all due respect and gratitude for your talk. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I have had other people say something similar about original sin, and I think it was true for me that I grew up with that overlay, and I think it would be more honest in a way for me to claim that rather than attribute it to, Western spirituality, but to say, I grew up in a way that was infused with this idea of original sin. And when I took up Buddhist practice, I was delighted to discover that there was a very different orientation. So I think I appreciate you naming that. Yeah.
Well, thank you for naming that, because I've on this Buddhist path, I've met countless people in the Sanghas that I attend who have been severely traumatized and damaged by the way that Western religious traditions have sort of indoctrinated them with this idea. So I hear you on that. Thank you so much.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And Charles.
Hi, I've never had the pleasure of hearing you before. But I want to compliment you on a couple of things. First of all, number one, in your meditation, you speak with perfect volume and clarity. Some other teachers that sort of get into a low conversational and go down at the end, and you can't hear what they're saying, and it creates tension in the meditation, whereas you come through loud and clear, and it's really good. So I want to compliment you on that, and also on the breadth of your knowledge and the way you're able to relate it in sort of what I would say a layman palatable way. It's really wonderful. Now, having been, and I'm a novitiate at this, so I do have just a couple of questions. Number one, I have heard that, yes, Buddha said, I teach one thing, suffering, that there's suffering and the end of suffering. But I've also heard it said that Buddha said, I teach one thing, and that's freedom. And one thing, and my goal, one thing is happiness. So how do you sort of interrelate that? And I've got a couple of other questions quickly too.
Well, the quote that I made, which there is some dispute about whether the Buddha actually said that, includes both parts, Charles. So he says, I teach one thing and one thing only, but it's actually two things: suffering and the end of suffering, which is freedom or happiness. So I think that those two things in a Buddhist framework come together and go together very intentionally. In other words, freedom and happiness aren't the island where it all works out. They're not, we don't get to jump over that and get somewhere. We go through. We practice what I was describing as this practice of being with all of our experience, the pleasant, the unpleasant, etc. And that is the doorway to freedom. That is the doorway to happiness, not by kind of leapfrogging over. And I would have more to say, and I know there are other hands, but I'm also aware that we are right about at time. So, do you have
I have
one
a question.
more?
Yeah, you
Yeah.
said that you find refuge within, but then you said you find refuge in the Dharma. So that's not within. So my question is, how is that not in?
Well, that could be debated, right? Is the Dharma within or is the Dharma without?
Well, if it was within, you
So,
wouldn't need anybody to teach it to you.
well, the Dharma is a practice and a set of teachings that are pointing us to become aware of what's arising moment by moment. And that Dharma is both within and without. The awareness of what's happening is also both within and without. The reorientation, however, for us, most of us as Westerners, is from looking outside and trying to get refuge in this case, to starting to pay attention to what's here and noticing our relationship to all of what we are responding to. That's what I mean by within. Ultimately, we're not going to find a sharp line between within and without, right? And it is awareness that's the bridge, we might say, between what we usually think of as within and without. But most of us aren't paying attention to awareness. We're paying attention to what we would call in Buddhism the objects of awareness, right? We're not paying attention to awareness. We're paying attention to our thoughts and our sight and the things we see and the things we smell and the things we think, and we think all of that. Those are the objects. The reorientation is to begin to cultivate awareness and to actually become aware of awareness itself as the ultimate refuge. Yeah. So that is a big can of worms that I just opened, and I did it with 1 minute left. So I am. I hope that for you as a newbie, as you said, that it will be inspiration to keep going, because the Dharma is wide and vast. And for me, the teaching of refuge is just this beautiful doorway into the teachings, because in some ways it asks for this reorientation, which is for me at the heart of the whole path.
Okay.
That it's not that we're trying to get somewhere, it's that we're looking to shift our relationship to everything. And in that shift of our relationship to everything, everything changes, even if nothing changes externally. And the last thing I will say, because it's important in the time and place that we're in now, is just to underscore that is not passivity. Shifting our relationship to everything happens here, but that is what allows us then to go into the world and to respond rather than react, to engage with the tremendous complexity and difficulties, plural, that we are facing from a place that isn't just repeating the same old stuff, that allows us to come from a new place in which the possibility of freedom, the possibility of what the Buddha would say is true happiness, unfolds. Yeah. So I'm sorry that I was unable to take your question. I could stay after if you like, Carol, but I want to hit a pause and see. Do you want to say something else? Or
I
no?
just if you are happy to stay a couple of minutes more, we can take Carol.
Okay, great. I will just say for those who enjoyed the talk or are interested that it was announced at the beginning that I will be co-leading I think it's a 9-month training program through Spirit Rock called Deep Dive Dharma, where we'll be taking up a whole variety of kind of core Buddhist teachings with the intent, this speaks to Violet's question at the beginning, of really taking what may feel like esoteric teaching and finding a way to really metabolize and integrate it into daily life. So I just want to sort of flag that and invite those of you who may be interested to check that out. And there's a link now in the chat where you can learn more about that. So, yeah.
And just to add on that, Pamela, I'll be happy to, if you can send me that link, specific link in the meantime, as we post the recording into the Sangha Live Dharma Library, I can put the
Great.
link. So
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you. So I'll just do a brief dedication so that we can formally close, and then I'm happy to respond, Carol, to your question. So I feel very filled by the dialogue and the opportunity to be with all of you today, and invite you just to take a moment to feel what's here in you, to notice what may have been touched or stirred from our time together. And as is the practice, we offer up, extend out, and share with a quality of open hands, open hearts, and generosity. May any goodness or benefit of our time together today be freely and generously shared with all beings everywhere. By the power and truth of our practice together, may all beings be free from suffering, and may we, together with all beings, awaken and be free.
Here, here.
So thank you for your kind attention today, and those who need to go, please. I'm happy to stay a little longer and respond. Yeah. Hi.
Hello, Pamela. Thank you so much for your teaching. You are clear and gentle and deep, and I appreciate everything that you've said. I've practiced meditation most of my adult life. I have a pretty regular daily practice. I have found, especially recently, that I'm dealing with strong feelings of fear a lot of the time, as many of us are, for some of the reasons that you stated earlier in your talk. I find that my response to fear comes in the form of flight, fight, or freeze. And so when I need refuge the most, I am least able to find it within myself, because I think the biological imperatives come into play, and I become reactive in one or another or all of those ways.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to put out.
So that's what refuge is for, is when we find ourselves triggered, which we will in those ways. That's a very, as you said, it's a biological response. That finding refuge means first and foremost to take care of our nervous system, right? To notice that we're in that state, which it sounds like you do. And then to find, what does it mean for me to calm down, basically? I think sometimes there are different phases of our practice. There's the calming down and there's the waking up. I often hear people describing all of meditative practice as being just about calming down, but that's not the whole practice. There's calming down, which is the soothing of the nervous system so that then we can open and be with what's here. And what's here, as you said, is very frightening right now. I couldn't agree more. So it requires this even greater degree of care and tending so that we can open and be with what's here. And if that there's no single way to do that. There's a beautiful story from the story of the Buddha's awakening in which he is being besieged by, sometimes archetypally described as the arrows of Mara, which is often described as internal, the voices of judgment. But I think someone else was saying it's internal and external, right? So when things are difficult, when we're being besieged by external things that are difficult, that are causing internal things that are difficult, then what do? And in the story, the Buddha does two things. One is he says, I see you, Mara. I know you, Mara, right? So for you, the first step is to say, oh, I recognize that I'm in fight, flight, or freeze, which you're doing. So that's the first piece. The second thing that he does is when Mara comes in and whispers in his ear, threatening him, who do you think you are? He's placing doubt in his ear. The Buddha reaches down and touches the earth. And for me, this is a symbolic gesture, but an important one, because I think for all of us in these times, we need to find, what does that mean for us? What does it mean for you to find that sense of touching the earth, which is, as I was guiding in the meditation, it's that sense of feeling held, feeling a sense of stability. And it may be that when you're in that state of trigger, that it's actually useful to go lie down on the ground, right? It may be that it's a matter of going out and looking at a tree or being in nature. But what it is will be different for different people, so I don't want to say exactly. What I do think is important in that gesture is that the Buddha isn't, when he's being besieged, going up into his mind, or dissociating or checking out. He's going down. He's going down to the earth. He's going down to the ground. And that is an important sort of directional pointer, I think, for all of us, right? So again, like others, I don't have a simple 3 steps, here's what to do, but I will certainly appreciate the difficulty that you're describing, and I'm sure that it's shared by many people, including myself. And then really the invitation to explore and see, what does it mean? How do you find your ground, right? As the heat keeps going up, in our world. Yeah.
How to find your ground and stand your ground.
Yep, exactly. Well, you can't stand your ground if you don't find your ground, right? Which is another way of saying it's not helpful to respond to the world that's a big mess from a triggered place. It actually just makes things worse. So all of this teaching about finding your ground, about finding refuge, about calming down the nervous system, all of that, again, isn't passivity. It's not a withdrawal. It's doing that so that we can then respond from a place of wisdom, from a place of creativity, from a place of kindness, rather than just adding fire, adding fire on top of fire, adding trigger on top of trigger. We certainly don't need that, right? How we do that is for us to discover. Yeah.
That's helpful. Thank you.
I appreciate your naming the fear that's here for so many of us, as we are looking at a world that feels very much on tilt, Yeah. Thank you. Okay, my friends, thank you so much for your care and attention, and may we all take care of each other and be well in these difficult times.